the Bible says that we believe, quote, according to the working of his mighty power, end quote. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 19. B.B. Warfield wrote, and I quote, "Nevertheless, it may be contended that the future, as the past, of Christianity itself is bound up with the fortunes of Calvinism," end quote. The Works of Benjamin B. Warfield, Volume 5, page 366. That striking remark made by Warfield appeared in his article titled simply, Calvinism. Warfield was not afraid to be called a Calvinist, nor was he afraid to use the term to describe what he believed. Warfield wrote, quote, "Calvinism is an ambiguous term insofar as it is currently employed in 2 or 3 senses," end quote, page 353. Warfield is right. The term Calvinism has more than one meaning, and many today would do well to study ambiguity before mindlessly attacking people who use the term Calvinism. Warfield continues, quote, "Sometimes it designates merely the individual teaching of John Calvin. Sometimes it designates more broadly the doctrinal system confessed by the body of Protestant churches known historically in distinction from the Lutheran churches as the Reformed churches," end quote, page 353. Notice how Warfield describes Calvinism as a doctrinal system confessed by specific Protestant churches. This is important, for we have many today who profess to be Reformed but despise doctrine and seek to be ecumenical with Roman Catholics. J.I. Packer would be one example of this. Such individuals do not understand, or they do not believe, the doctrines of sola scriptura and justification by faith alone. Warfield continues, quote, "He who believes in God without reserve and is determined that God shall be God to him in all his thinking, feeling, willing, in the entire compass of his life, activities, intellectual, moral, spiritual, throughout all his individual, social, religious relations, is, by the force of the strictest of all logic, which presides over the outworking of principles into thought and life, by the very necessity of the case, a Calvinist." Pages 354, 355. Notice how Warfield's remark emphasizes the primacy of the intellect. He speaks of the intellectual, of the thinking, of the strictest of all logic. Speaking of Calvinism and Lutheranism, Warfield wrote, quote, "But it is misleading to find the formative principle of either type of Protestantism in its difference from the other. They have infinitely more in common than in distinction. Luther and Melanchthon and the compromising Butzer were no less jealous for absolute predestination than Zwingli and Calvin. Even Zwingli could not surpass Luther in sharp and unqualified assertion of it," end quote, page 357. I have met more than a few individuals who profess to be Calvinists, but have never read Martin Luther's magnificent book, The Bondage of the Will. Speaking of how Calvinism and Lutheranism both teach justification by faith alone, Warfield wrote, and I quote, "Calvinism asks with Lutheranism, indeed, that most poignant of all questions, 'What shall I do to be saved?' and answers it as Lutheranism answers it," end quote, page 358. If you have not read Martin Luther or Martin Chemnitz on the doctrine of justification by faith alone, then you've missed out. You see, like Lutherans, Calvinists emphasize the distinction between the law and the gospel. This is important, for today Federal Vision heretics who reject justification by faith alone pretend that only Lutheranism holds to a law-gospel distinction, but this lie is easily refuted with a simple reading of Calvin, Beza, Ursinus, Turretin, Owen, and so on. Speaking of the soteriology of a Calvinist, Warfield wrote, and I quote, "What lies at the heart of his soteriology is the absolute exclusion of the creaturely element in the initiation of the saving process, that so the pure grace of God may be magnified," end quote, page 359. Salvation from start to finish is by sovereign grace alone. Some today, claiming to be infralapsarian, teach that God did not decree the fall of Adam. This mistake was present in Warfield's time, for Calvinism was on the decline even then. This mistake has grown larger now, but Warfield correctly rejected this nonsense. He wrote, quote, "Even historians of repute are found representing infralapsarianism as involving, or at least permitting, denial that the fall has a place in the decrees of God at all. In point of fact, there is and can be no difference among Calvinists as to the inclusion of the fall in the decree of God. To doubt this inclusion is to place oneself at once at variance with the fundamental Calvinistic principle which conceives all that comes to pass teleological and ascribes everything that actually occurs ultimately to the will of God." End quote. Page 364. Well, I hope you've enjoyed these quotes from Benjamin B. Warfield's article, Calvinism. This article can be found in Volume 5 of his works. And I encourage you to read Warfield. He's very strong in his Calvinism.